everyone. Today we are doing part one of evolution, and we'll skip down to our question of the day: how do species evolve? And I always start off my lessons on evolution with just the definition of evolving, and that is simply change over time. So, how do species change over time is kind of what we're looking at today. So I'm not going to go over any of the pre-lecture. I believe none of that will turn up on the exam, but it is good to go through and get a background of this and then make sure you do the Connect quiz for this as well. But it talks a little bit about chemical evolution, and we're just going to jump right into this. So as a review, what are the steps of the scientific method? First, you make an observation, and this should be review from way at the start of the semester. And based off that observation, you form a hypothesis. And then you're going to experiment or test that hypothesis and come up with some sort of conclusion. So when we're talking about biological evolution, we're talking about species changing over time. Or in other words, when species branch off from a common ancestor. And I believe we talk more about this in evolution too, but there are phylogenetic trees. So let's say we have this species here that branches off into two different species that can no longer interbreed with each other. And this right here would be the common ancestor. And they branched into two different species, or they evolved, they changed over time. So different hypotheses were proposed to explain the mechanism of biological evolution, and keep in mind these were like hundreds of years ago. So we had hypothesis 1, which is the inheritance of acquired traits by Lamarck, and hypothesis 2, which was natural selection by Charles Darwin. So hypothesis 1, proposed by, and excuse my French, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, who was a French naturalist. You don't have to write this. This is just information to know. And he published a book with his theory in 1801. And his theory was that acquired traits which are traits that develop after birth, are passed on to offspring. So, for example, I've been playing the piano since I was 3 years old. I took lessons all the way through high school. I'm not a fantastic piano player by any means, but that is a trait I acquired. I wasn't born knowing how to play the piano. I have to learn it. So we would consider that an acquired trait. So my kids were not born knowing how to play the piano. They might have a genetic advantage on understanding how to play the piano, but they still have to learn. And over time, traits change as species adapt to their environment. And so the classic example in biology that's typically used is giraffe neck length. So what Lamarck hypothesized, and that's as far in as I can go, is that originally all giraffes had short necks like this. And you can see they're having a hard time getting their food from the trees. But giraffes stretch their necks in order to reach food so they can eat. And with continual stretching, most giraffes now have long necks. So they would stretch their neck, it would get longer, and then when they had their babies would have longer necks too. And now we're like, oh my goodness, that doesn't make any sense at all. But keep in mind, this was 1801. So at the time, it probably made sense. But why would this mechanism not work? It's because acquired traits do not change the DNA in your germ cells. Oops. So again, the ability that I have to play the piano, that's a trait that I have, but it's acquired. And even though I learned before I had kids, doesn't mean that my kids are going to inherit that trait because it doesn't change anything in my DNA, in my germ cells. So just because these giraffes develop the ability to stretch their necks and get the food, doesn't change anything in their DNA. So hypothesis number 2, natural selection proposed by Darwin, says that some individuals are better able to survive and reproduce. So I tell my cute little 7th graders when they're coming to class, you guys, today you're going to learn the purpose of life. Thinking I'm going to get into something philosophical. And I tell them, biologically speaking, it's all about surviving long enough to reproduce. And they're like, what? But biologically speaking, the goal is to survive long enough to reproduce and pass on your genes to the next generation. And some individuals being better able to do this is because of genetic variation. Or in other words, not everyone has the same genes. And this genetic variation is a result of mutations, random mutations in the DNA, which can result in a advantageous trait, a disadvantageous trait, am I saying that right? And one that is neither an advantage nor a disadvantage. So those with traits allowing for better survival in a particular environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. A lot of writing today. And those individuals that are unable to compete will have fewer or no offspring because they die before they get the chance to reproduce. And again, the example we will look at is the giraffe neck. We love giraffes. So with Darwin's hypothesis, of natural selection, originally the giraffe neck length varied. So you had some that had longer necks, some that had shorter necks, whereas in Lamarck's hypothesis, everyone had short necks originally. In Darwin's hypothesis, because there's a competition for resources, for food, this causes the long-necked giraffes to have the most offspring, because this poor little short-necked giraffe is going to die before he or she can reproduce and have offspring, and they don't pass on their short-necked genes. However, these two, with a gene for a long neck, are able to get the food so they can survive long enough to reproduce and pass on the gene for longer necks. And guess what? Over time, you're going to see more giraffes having longer necks and less giraffes with the shorter necks. Makes a little more sense, right? And I believe Darwin came out with his hypothesis about 50, 60 years later. So, question of the day. Sorry, my Sharpie's bleeding. How do species evolve? So, oh, this is a long answer. Let's see if I can shorten this. I'll read what I have written here. The frequency of genes change over time. Some genetic mutations are advantageous and natural selection may act on it. Some reach prevalence by chance. In either case, when more mutations are acquired in the gene pool and become very different, species evolve. So I'm going to shorten that and say random mutations can happen to be advantageous. Maybe not, but in the case of evolution, let's look at the ones that are. Lead to an advantageous trait. Whoops. The individuals with the advantageous trait are more likely to survive and reproduce. Passing that trait to their offspring. And so you'll end up seeing an increase, got too many arrows going on here, increase in that trait. And so the entire species can change over time. They can evolve. So natural selection is going to require 3 elements, and for the exam, you need to know what they are. You don't necessarily need to know the definitions, but know that there needs to be variation, competition, and heritability. So what variation means, if there's a variety of things, you have a lot of options, we'll say. So individuals are different from one another. So back to giraffes, some have short necks, some have long necks, some have medium necks. If we're talking about, why is my mind going blank? Let's let's stick with that example for now. And the reason why we have this variation is because of mutations, because of immigration. You have different species moving to different places and breeding with others. Meiosis, the formation of eggs and sperm. Remember, we have independent assortment and crossing over, which results in variation in 4 unique haploid cells. So 3 sources of genetic variation are mutations, immigration, and meiosis. There also needs to be competition. And so this variation that we have up here allows some individuals to be better at surviving and reproducing. There also has to be heritability, or think of like inheritance, inherited traits. So advantageous traits must be passed on to offspring through DNA. So why would this heritability be important? Because if a trait can't be passed on, then there's not going to be any evolution. I think this next question is super interesting because bacteria reproduce so fast that we can observe evolution within just a short amount of time. So, penicillin is an antibiotic drug that interferes with the development of cell walls in bacteria, killing them. Imagine that in a population of bacteria, one bacterium develops a random mutation that blocks the action of penicillin, making it penicillin resistant. If this mutation is heritable, what does natural selection predict? So think about the possible outcomes. You can pause it for a minute if you'd like, but I'm going to jump right into it. So what would happen is if you have one bacterium that is not affected by penicillin, chances are all the other ones are going to die, and you're going to be left with that one bacterium that has a mutation that was completely random that just happened to make it resistant to penicillin. So, the first thing is that the penicillin resistant bacteria is more likely to survive and reproduce. On the other hand, the bacteria without the mutation are going to die. And if you're dead, guess what? You don't reproduce. Now, some of them may survive long enough to reproduce, but if penicillin is still in the environment, then those offspring are probably going to die. So, what you'll end up with are more bacteria in the population that are resistant to penicillin. So that population has changed over time. Therefore, that bacterial population has evolved because you see an increase in a particular trait. Okay, so natural selection is based on nature or the environment, but artificial selection is what it sounds like. Artificial, I associate that with fake. So this is not what occurs naturally, and this is when humans select for desirable traits in a species. So humans, rather than the environment or nature, act as the selecting agent. And again, two classic examples. The first one we'll talk about is corn. And this original right here, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, I'm sorry. It's called this. And we turned it into modern delicious corn. It's corn! I love corn. And I love that song. If you know, you know. So what happened, and this was thousands of years ago, they have these little almost grass-like plants, and they noticed that some of them had larger kernels that were more edible or tasty than others, and so they would pollinate those two plants with the best kernels, and their offspring would have the better kernels. And over time, those could get bigger and bigger due to random mutations, and over thousands of years, we have sweet, delicious corn on the cob. Humans did that with the help of random mutations. Another example is wolves being domesticated into dogs. This was 130,000 years ago that they believe this started. So imagine a bunch of, shoot, I'm getting my timelines wrong. Early humans or humans? Yeah, humans around, or hunter-gatherers around a campfire, and the wolves start to come near. And if the wolf seems menacing or dangerous, they're probably going to kill it. But if they see one that maybe is more friendly or can help them with hunting or protection, they're going to choose two of those with those traits to reproduce. And they would keep doing that. They would breed the more tame, friendly dogs, wolves, and over time we got dogs. And eventually we went a little bit out of control with this. If you look at all the approximately 100 different breeds of dogs, we would say, oh, I want to breed this dog to be cute. And so we would take the two cutest dogs and breed them, and they would have cute offspring, and we could keep doing this over and over. And over time, the dogs are going to get cuter and cuter, or maybe smaller and smaller, or smarter and smarter, larger and larger. Whatever the trait is that we're looking for, we can select those traits, select which dogs breed together, and their offspring will have those traits. And over time, you can get a huge variation of the traits that you want, from Chihuahuas to Great Danes. But along with this, if you know anything about purebred dogs, they usually have genetic problems. Like labs, for example, tend to have a lot of hip problems. I give a whole lesson on this in seventh grade on just artificial selection in dogs, which is why I'm kind of going off here. But there are some disadvantages to artificial selection as well. But we got corn from it, so I'm not mad at it. All right, evidence for evolution. We have 4 different pieces that you need to know: the fossil record, biogeography, anatomical evidence, and biochemical evidence. So we will start with the fossil record. So the way fossils are formed, and you've probably learned this before, we're teaching this right now in 7th grade. Hard structures buried in sediment become mineralized and enclosed around sedimentary rock. And you've probably learned that the fossil record is incomplete because the conditions for fossils to form, you have to have hard structures that can mineralize and make impressions in the mud. You have to die in an area where there is mud or where the the sediment is able to become mineralized. So only about 1% of living things fossilized, 1% of, why is my brain freezing? Of living things are fossilized, I think is what that's trying to say. And then, due to tectonic movement and deposition of layers upon these fossils and stuff, only a fraction of those are ever found. That being said, we have found a lot of fossils. So transition fossils are characteristics of 2 different groups, and they can reveal changes from one group to another. And perhaps 2 of the most notable are Tiktaalik, which is the transition from fish to amphibians. So the transition from only being able to live in the water to being able to live on both land and the water. And so Tiktaalik is here in the center. It's the transition fossil. And we have a regular fish here, and due to random mutations, the eyes started to move to the top of the head rather than the sides. The fins, let's see what's going on here. The fins start to change, and then over time we can evolve into this, which is more well adapted to live on the land and in the water, whereas the fish can only live in the land. And this is kind of the intermediate between the 2. It shows characteristics of both. Another is this amazing creature, the Archaeopteryx. And this was the transition from reptile to birds. So this has characteristics of both reptiles and birds. It has teeth like reptiles. It has claws. It has a tail with a vertebrae. It has like reptiles. It has feathers like birds. And so it's kind of an intermediate between reptiles and birds, which is evidence that reptiles evolved into birds, or certain species of reptiles evolved into birds over time. And there are some other transitional bird fossils that have been found in China. And onto biogeography. This is the distribution of species in different places. So species evolved in specific regions and spread out and evolved even more in new locations. island species being the most different because they're isolated. So an example of this are marsupials. So you find a lot of marsupials in Australia. So Australian marsupials fill similar ecological roles to placental mammals on other continents. But they only live in Australia. So Australia at one point broke off from Pangaea, and I guess you could consider it an island, and it was kind of separated and isolated from all the other continents, and the marsupials were already there, and so they kind of took over and filled the ecological roles that placental mammals fill on the other continents. Something else interesting is that there are no rabbits in South America. And I think Darwin was the one to notice this. And rabbits evolved in Asia after South America drifted away. But there are guinea pig-like rodents that evolved to fill similar ecological roles in South America. That was a new fact to me. This, I think, is the most compelling, the anatomical evidence. So, comparison of anatomy confirms that species share a common ancestor. So, again, the most famous example are the forelimb bones. And we call it a homologous structure. So, remember, homo means the same, so homologous structure. So, they share a common evolutionary origin. So if you look at this here, we're looking at a bird wing, a bat wing, a whale fin, a cat forelimb, a horse forelimb, and a human. And they all have different functions. They do different things. These are made for flying, not made. These are adapted for flying. This is adapted for swimming. These are adapted for walking or running, and human arms are adapted for, well, whatever you do with your arms. And if you look, there's a similar pattern among all of these, even though they have completely different functions. So in pink, there is a single upper arm bone with all of these. And next in like the purple blue, you see there are two lower arm bones in each of these. And then you have green wrist bones or metacarpals. They're harder to see on these ones, but they're there. And then the phalanges, or what we know as fingers in the human. And with the horse, they fuse together. And they've adapted and evolved to change to fit their environment. But the pattern is basically the same, indicating that they share a common ancestor, which I find very interesting. Okay, analogous structures, on the other hand, are structures that are functionally similar, but no common evolutionary origin. according to the penguin. Functionally similar. But no common evolutionary origin. So they arose or evolved independently. Hope you can read my writing there. So examples are flippers in a penguin and fins on a fish. So they have the same function. Their function is to swim. And yet they both arose from different evolutionary origins. Another are insect wings like butterfly wings and bat wings. So they both have the same function to fly, yet they are, if you go back far enough, they share a common ancestor, but they're not closely related. And we've got to talk about vestigial structures, and I think this is very interesting as well. So anatomical features present in an ancestral species but no longer serve a designed function. So embryonic pharyngeal arches, which are essentially gills, and post-anal tells. So if you look at a pig embryo and a chick embryo, early on in development, they have these pharyngeal pouches and a post-anal tell, as do humans at some point early on in development. And in humans, the post-anal tell ends up being the parts of the coccyx, the tailbone, and the gill arches become parts of the inner ear and the neck, I believe. And you will also find remnants of hip bones in whales and snakes, which are no longer used. And I can mention a few more, like the appendix in humans, for example, if we consider that a vestigial structure, it may serve some sort of function in immunity, but what it was used for in the past with our ancestors was to help them digest the interesting things they were eating, like bark off of trees and plants and things like that. Wisdom teeth are vestigial structures. We used to need to have those extra teeth to again help us chew up the different diet that we had back then, and now they're no longer necessary, and so our jaws are shrinking and we don't have room for those wisdom teeth, so we have to get them pulled out. What's another? Goosebumps. So when you get goosebumps, our ancestors, back when we needed to have hair to keep us warm, when they got cold, there's I think it's called the erector pili muscle, would cause the hair to stand up and it would kind of form this layer of insulation around them to keep them warm. Or if you've ever scared a cat and watched their fur puff up, it makes them look bigger. And today we still get goosebumps when our hair stands up, but it doesn't serve any purpose for us. So just a few examples of vestigial structures. Okay. Biochemical evidence. And this is very compelling as well. The genetic code is the same in all living species. Every living species uses DNA to pass on their genes and to code for proteins. So the genetic code is the same in all living species, but gene mutations occur over time. So the closer two species are related, the more similar their genes. And an example is the comparison of cytochrome C. And you don't need to know that, but cytochrome C is used in the electron transport chain in cellular respiration. And so the graph shows the number of codon amino acid changes between humans and other species. They're just looking at a specific gene. So if we're comparing humans to humans, obviously there would be 0 differences. Humans to monkeys, about 2. Pigs is 9. And you can see as we get to something like yeast, it gets higher and higher. So the further down this list we go, the more distantly related we are. So that's it for part 1. I don't know if I need to give this little speech anymore. I've been teaching evolution for maybe 11 years or so, and I used to have to give like a what's the word? A disclaimer before, like, hey, if this goes against what you believe religiously or personally or whatever, I'm just telling you the scientific evidence, the evidence that we have, and you do what you want with that. And we can't teach religion in a science course because it's not science based. I better stop talking. I'm just saying this is the evidence that we have in science, and do what you like with the evidence. I am a firm believer in evolution. If you're not, that is okay. But this is what you will be tested on, is the evidence that we have as of now. Okay, over and out. Have a good one.